Have you ever thought about the history of SpaceX, the most promising space exploration company in the universe? Well, SpaceX started with a nerd who grew up in the 70s to 80s reading books and comics about colonizing other planets, alien races, and traveling the universe. I had a passion for space exploration. It is more than just a passion. I have always believed that space is one of the businesses of the future. That the space exploration that was done until then was not yet ready. There was a lot to be changed, and I wanted to help. I could watch things happen or be part of the change. Looking at it today, the colonization of Mars is more concrete, but it was not always so. For SpaceX to get where it is now, I had to negotiate old Soviet missiles with Russian mobsters, saw my company almost go bankrupt, put a car in orbit, saw several failures and explosions happen. Yes, it was not easy. But who said that creating a space exploration company would be simple? Noble causes versus great fears. I am driven by great fears and not ashamed to share them in my lectures and interviews. With the success of my online ventures between the late 1990s and the early 2000s, surviving the internet bubble, I began to focus my efforts on major projects that seek to mitigate my fears of the extermination of humanity. One of its bets is to expand the human presence in the solar system, with the establishment of populations on several planets, starting with Mars. I am getting closer and closer to my goal of placing an expedition on the Red Planet and starting colonization. What was an impossible dream and seemed like an eccentric conversation today is seen by analysts as viable after almost 2 decades of development of rockets and aerospace solutions. It all started in 2001 when I created the Mars Oasis, a project to install an experimental greenhouse on Mars and try to grow food in the arid and toxic Martian soil. To get there, I wanted to purchase a Russian intercontinental ballistic missile at an affordable price. If possible, a model already used. The idea was eccentric even by the entrepreneur's standards, and one of my best friends since my university days, Adi Oresi, believed I was going crazy. Resi even invited close friends to try an intervention and dissuade me from the idea. He was not successful with the task. In October 2001, I traveled to Russia with Jim Cantrell, who worked in aerospace, and Resi himself for meetings with companies like Cosmotros and NPO Lavochkin, who built probes for the Soviet government to explore Venus and Mars during the space race. After a long lunch followed by coffee with cigars, I and my partners were treated with little respect by the Russians, who considered us newbies. The failure of the first attempt, however, did not prevent me from going to the Russians again. This time to buy not 1, but 3 missiles. A few months later, in February 2002, I landed in Moscow with my team for a new round of negotiations. This time, I took someone more experienced to join the team. Mike Griffin, a renowned engineer in the field and who years later would take over the administration of NASA. After a few shots of vodka, I asked Cosmotros representatives directly how much each rocket would cost. I tried to negotiate the starting price of $8 million per unit, but again I was not taken seriously. The disappointment of the second attempt made me believe that it was not possible to negotiate with Russians. I knew I had no money to buy from another supplier. At that point, where many would give up, I showed a side of my entrepreneurship that would accompany me in future business. If there is no solution available, I would create that solution. The breakthrough came on the flight from Moscow when I called my partners and said I thought they could make their rocket. It was the fulfillment of a childhood dream when I played building rockets in my backyard and read science fiction. In their accounts, the cost of the material to build a rocket was very small, and they could reduce the cost of production by 90% by verticalizing the business. With the commercial space exploration project matured, I met with an organization of enthusiasts studying technologies to explore the Red Planet. I had not given up on my idea of a greenhouse on Mars to allow, in the future, human beings to colonize the planet and reduce the possibility of our species' extinction. After generous donations, I started rounds of discussions with experts to gather ideas on how to take the greenhouse with a mouse plant harvest and bring the mouse back to Earth. The Space Race with SpaceX. In May 2002, with $100 million of my personal fortune that I got from selling PayPal, I created Space Exploration Technologies, or SpaceX. The company's goal? Spread human civilization across space. The troubled start with the Russians gave way to American private engineering. As a good nerd, the first rocket was named Falcon 1 in honor of the Millennium Falcon from the movie Star Wars. It was successfully launched in March 2006 and served as a test for the Falcon 9, launched in 2019. SpaceX has achieved consecutive records of efficiency and the novelty of being a private company achieving achievements that only state-owned companies like NASA had achieved. The American agency, incidentally, is one of the main customers of SpaceX, which supplies the International Space Station, in addition to placing commercial and military satellites in orbit. In 2014, the U.S. government gave SpaceX efficiency in numbers, while the country's Air Force paid up to $400 million for a launch for the United Launch Alliance. The same operation was conducted by my company for less than $100 million. In addition to the lower cost, there is also the spectacle to watch. Each SpaceX release is a live broadcast over the internet, with presenters, animation, and company employees cheering and celebrating. Even a Tesla Roadster car was launched into space by SpaceX with a Falcon Heavy rocket. The vehicle is manned by a mannequin in special costumes, nicknamed Starman. In addition to the achievement of reaching space, SpaceX innovated by reusing parts. Parts of the launch burners and the rocket core return and land gently on Earth, or a drone ship to the delight of employees who scream during the transmission. And who controls everything is none other than me, the CEO and Chief Technology Officer, Elon. I hold 78% of the voting rights in the company of more than 7,000 employees and, in 2016, announced the plan to colonize Mars with the arrival of the first cargo in 2022. If you've liked it so far, could you please like the video? Challenges I faced funding such problems, and how NASA came at the right time. If you've been following Tesla Company, you would know that 2008 was the worst year of my life so far. My electric car company began the year fighting public scorn that doubted that one day it would be able to put a car on the street. There was indeed no lack of reasons. After all, deliveries had been overdue for years, and the money never seemed to be enough. On the SpaceX side, it was no different. 2 launches had gone wrong. Things were also delayed, and dozens of employees continued to live in adapted homes in the middle of the Pacific, where they awaited the next and perhaps last launch with what was left of hope. As for me on the private side, my marriage ended, while on the public side the press used me as a punching bag and ready joke due to the difficulties of my companies. In the midst of all this, I was in a deep depression when I started selling some of my most precious goods to raise extra money. When July came, I saw that I only had enough money to reach the end of the year. It was necessary to raise money to keep the companies operating. The problem is that 2008 was not just a bad year for me, but the financial market and the world as a whole. The last major crisis of capitalism had made investors disappear. If it was already difficult to find investors for a space company that was unable to make a successful launch, now it would be even more so. Amid all this, the company's 3rd launch was scheduled, to the point where one team started to transport and assemble everything on the island of Kwajalein. Another team would remain in California, where it would start the research and development of a new project, Falcon 9. That is, a Falcon with 9 engines and much more capacity of cargo transport. My idea was to create something that could be used as a possible replacement for the space shuttle, which had already announced its retirement, and therefore bid for very profitable contracts that NASA would soon offer to supply the missions it did. In early August of that year, everyone crossed their fingers for a 3rd launch. The rocket was loaded with an Air Force satellite and some NASA experiments that together weighed 170 kilograms. After a first attempt, which had to be canceled in the nick of time, the rocket took flight the same day after some adjustments. With no indication that it could be in trouble, Falcon 1 rose spectacularly until Stage 1 and 2 were separated. Since I was audacious enough to not only correct the flaws of the previous launch, I ordered that improvements and new features be implemented in the rocket for this 3rd flight. and that was a big mistake. Further analysis would reveal that the new versions of the Merlin engines had given off an unexpected thrust during the separation process, which caused the stages to collide, damaging the top of the rocket and its engine. And maybe the worst was not even that, but the unknown facts about the previous problem that caused the explosion of Flight Number 2. Without actually launching the second stage, we did not know if the failure had been remedied. Faced with this and other problems, a fourth and probably last launch were scheduled for September 28 of that year. At that time, some engineers had been stationed on the island for years, so it just had to work to complement all our efforts. They had been separated from their families, attacked by heat and mosquitoes, sometimes without an abundance of food, all while dealing with me and the accumulated frustration of a series of failed attempts. Making this launch run smoothly was a matter of honor for each of us. All the pains that had passed until then would be forgotten if it worked this time. In the late afternoon of that day, Falcon 1 went up for the fourth time, now carrying 163 kilos of nothing. It was necessary to use a fictitious cargo, since neither the Army nor any company or government agreed to put something of value on a rocket that did not have a very favorable launch retrospective. When the rocket fired into space, it was greeted by screams and whistles from the team that accompanied everything from the SpaceX building in California. As the first stage completed its cycle and detached itself from the body of the second stage, which would continue the journey for another 90 seconds, the employees did not seem to believe that everything was going so well. 9 minutes after launch, Falcon 1 entered orbit, as planned. It had worked. The Falcon 1 had become the first privately built machine to accomplish this feat, after 6 years of trying, 4.5 years more than I had predicted. But it was there. But the celebration would not go very far. Shortly after all celebrations had subsided, I entered a meeting to address SpaceX's financial problems. In addition to having the Falcon 9 project to support, there was also the brand new Dragon project, a capsule that would be used to take supplies and, one day, astronauts to the International Space Station. According to logic, each of the surveys would cost more than $1 billion. Needless to say, SpaceX didn't have $1 billion. We would need to figure out how to do this at a fraction of the cost. With so many projects, the team kept growing, not to mention the move to a larger headquarters in Hawthorne, California. Don't forget that in addition to SpaceX being broke, Tesla was also broke. At that time, I looked at the calculations several times and thought, which one should I save? The little bit of money that I had could perhaps make a difference for one of the companies. However, that would mean the certain and painful death of the other. If I divvied that little bit in half for each one, maybe both would fail. The question was not a simple one. The salvation, at least for SpaceX, came in December 2008 when I heard rumors that NASA was preparing the first launch contract to replace the space shuttle. The contract value was more than $1 billion. The good news came on December 23rd when NASA awarded SpaceX a $1.6 billion contract. We were hired to make 12 flights to the space station. Where is SpaceX today? And so is SpaceX, a measly 18 years after its founding and less than 14 years after the first successful launch. By the end of 2017, more than 100 missions had already been contracted, between launched and scheduled flights which totaled more than $12 billion in contracts. Today, it is heading to be an excellent manufacturer not only of rockets, but also of satellites. After all, after building its almost 12,000 units that will integrate Starlink, we may start to manufacture out. And if that happens, get ready for a possible drop in prices, which will lead to more satellites in space, bigger and more technological. While the next turnarounds in the space market don't happen, SpaceX has to settle for the dozens of records that have broken and successes recorded so far. Some of them are: the first privately funded liquid fuel rocket to enter orbit, the first controlled landing of a first orbital rocket stage on land, the first private cargo, which was the Tesla Roadster, to escape Earth's gravity. SpaceX makes history as the first company to go into space. With a launch originally planned to take place on Wednesday, May 27, 2020, Dragon Crew was finally successfully launched Saturday, May 30th, 2020, bound for the International Space Station. The first launch attempt had been delayed due to unfavorable weather conditions, something that could have been repeated on Saturday. However, the launch was confirmed, and at 4:35 p.m. Brasilia time, the Dragon Crew spacecraft disengaged from the rocket and headed towards the ISS. The Demo 2 mission made history because it was the first manned mission carried out by a private company, SpaceX. It is also the first manned mission to leave American soil in a decade. The mission left the Cape Canaveral Air Base in Florida on a Falcon 9 rocket, taking American astronauts Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken. Both astronauts are back successfully from the mission. The Demo 2 mission is the first in a series of manned missions that SpaceX will conduct with NASA. This series is part of the Commercial Crew program, which should have at least 6 more missions destined for the International Station. If you enjoyed this, could you please like the video, subscribe, and suggest other stories you'd like to hear?